Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today, we welcome back Jacob Shapiro for another episode on India exclusively. Jacob, thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure.
Jacob, we talked last time about Japan, China, and the United States, but in this episode, I want to focus on India, specifically the government of Prime Minister Modi. So if you can give us your overall 30,000-foot view take on what's going on in India with the government, and then maybe we can get into some of the challenges there. What I'm observing, and the reason that I wanted to do this episode today, is I'm observing, as someone with Indian heritage and someone that travels to India on a regular basis, I'm viewing that country slip into Hindu nationalism and get the feeling that the secular nature of government in India is fading away. So that is my premise. That's what I'm coming in with. Jacob, I want to get your thoughts, but maybe don't let my initial take cloud your opinion here, and just tell us what you're feeling about with India.
Well, in classic Jewish fashion, let me first answer a question with a question and ask, where in India are you from? Like, where are you going when you're going to India?
So my family is in New Delhi. My wife's family is also in New Delhi.
Interesting. Okay. So I just want to preface for the listeners, I have a lot of ambivalence about India. And I honestly cannot make up my mind whether India is going to be a rising world power that's going to take over everything, or it's going to completely collapse in on itself into 5 different countries. I mean, I can make the argument to myself. I do make the argument to myself on an almost weekly basis, because India is that important in the global political system. So I'm going to play with both sides. If it feels like there's ambivalence, or if it feels like I'm being wishy-washy, it's because I am. It's because this is not something that is really easy to talk about.
The Bitcoin Layer is sponsored by River. Make sure to check out river.com today, or the link below in the description. River is our preferred place to purchase Bitcoin. Now, when you're buying Bitcoin, guys, there are several considerations. Number one, should I be using an exchange? Is the exchange custodying their own Bitcoin? Is the exchange using platforms to custody that we don't know? Is the exchange leveraging its Bitcoin for other purposes? Well, with River, we know that River does not use leverage of any kind. River also uses its own multi-sig solution so that your Bitcoin are not held by anybody else. So it's a very important thing to understand about what River offers. Now, River also has Lightning Network integration and a lot of other really exciting features. Go check out river.com today.
And I think you're exactly right. So if we're just looking at the broad, the last time we were talking, I tried to give a very succinct definition of the Chinese economy and Xi and redistributing wealth. If we try to do a very, very simple, overly simplified take on what's going on with India, you sort of hit the nail on the head right there. So Modi is the most popular Indian leader in Indian history since independence. I don't think that's going out too far on a limb. And he's done that not by reaching out to India's massive diversity, which is an incredibly diverse country. He's done that by consolidating the ranks of Hindu nationalists, which for a long time was a far right sort of ideology. And Modi sort of made it okay enough for center-right and others to buy into it. He's made it respectable in a certain way. The far rights are still there. I met an Israeli cab driver once who said in every house there's a trash can. So in every house there's a trash can. Like, you have the crazy people out there, but Modi has made this a really respectable point of view. And because of really the impotence of Congress, in addition, there's been no counter narrative. There has been no one who is talking about the value of Indian secularism or Indian diversity and things like that. The Hindu nationalist narrative has become well ensconced. Now, I can hear, by the way, that you say slipping into Hindu nationalism, that you think it's a negative thing. Maybe, maybe not. It sort of depends who you are. If you're in the Hindu majority, and you're finally going to get a government that is empowered to make government policy and build infrastructure in a way that previous Indian governments could not, because they were too busy dealing with the diversity and dealing with what a fundamentally diverse multi-ethnic, multilingual population looks like. So you sacrifice some diversity, maybe you get some actual coherence when it comes to policy. That might be a good thing. If you're a Muslim person living in some part of northern India, that's not going to look particularly good for you, because probably you're going to get an increase in communal violence. And I would say one of the reasons India has punched below its weight for so long, not had coherent government policy. And this is where I would say that Modi has fallen short the most, because, and it's my own bias to be less concerned with ideology. I sort of don't care about his ideology. What I care about with Modi is that he hasn't been able to follow through on a lot of terms and policies that he talked about, even with charity. Now, he's gotten some of them, like when you go to taxes and things, he's done some things, but look at these farmer protests. He was going to reshape Indian agricultural markets to be more free market oriented. The farmers protested and he had to backpedal. You look at cutting red tape and encouraging other foreign companies to invest in India. Well, that was what he said at the start. Then when COVID happened, it was all about self-reliance and Indian sovereignty and vertical integration of supply chains and things like that. If you even look within India itself, and this is why I asked where you're from in India, the divergence of India is absolutely massive. So if you're in southern India, GDP per capita is 4.2 times higher than it is if you're in northern India. That's true for infant mortality. That's true for literacy rates for women. And ironically, most of where Modi's support comes from, it comes from the northern areas that are more interested in that Hindu nationalist narrative to imbue their lives with meaning. Whereas southern India, that's where the business is. When you see foreign tech companies are going into India, they're going into a couple key states in southern India, many of which are the ones that the BJP, which is Modi's party, have not been able to capture. And that probably rings with a little bit of dissonance, hopefully, for your listeners, because everybody talks about Modi as the great businessman and encouraging Indian growth. No, he's not. Like, he has marshaled this coalition of Hindu nationalists in the north parts. The folks that are in the south, where economic growth is driving, that's where BJP is the weakest. They don't look at him as this big sort of economic force in general. So it's a very, very ambivalent picture. And ultimately, where I come down on India is, Modi's going to have, I don't know how many terms he's going to have. I shouldn't go out on a limb and say how many terms, but he's probably going to win this election by a very large margin. The BJP knows of its weakness in the South and has been trying to push into those areas. Is this going to be the time where he manages to push through the types of reforms and policies that India needs to be competitive, to realize its potential, to have growth that helps the entire population? That will be bad for minorities. It'll be good for whoever is in the majority. And Hindus are in the majority in general. So there are pros and cons to both of it. But if he gets elected and he's not able to push things through, then I think you're looking at an India that probably becomes a target of foreign powers in the same way India was in the 1800s, where India basically gave the British Empire an extra 100 years on its life. If India had not, if Britain had not wandered its way into India in the 1850s, probably the British Empire sets then, not in World War I and World War II. And you can see countries like the United States, like Japan, like Russia, all looking towards India, salivating at the prospect of the size of that market and the productivity gains that you could marshal and selling into it and building things there and things like that. So it's a critical election for India, because it's going to tell us whether Modi's going to follow through and whether you're going to get the good part of the Hindu nationalist swinge, or whether you're going to get the worst of both worlds, where you get more ideology, but you don't get a leader who can actually follow through on his policies.
So let's stick with policy, because you're right when I say slipping into, it does give away a little bit of my bias there. But I always try to remind myself that when I'm there, I'm not an Indian voter. And so my observation from the outside of the pros and cons of Modi is it's not done from a voter's perspective, just as you look at the criticism of Trump from outside of the United States, and you have to qualify that with, you don't understand as a voter what the pros and cons are for the American. You're just giving one outsider. So that is my bias, and I acknowledge that that's how I view it. So let's strip out the Hindu nationalist side of things and focus directly on policy. I do see on the ground some of the policies working in that the country itself is more capable to remove red tape or to allow growth or projects to be completed. So I view that as well. But what are some of the policies you think that truly levels India up, that maybe Modi has promised but hasn't delivered yet, or that he's promising, or that maybe it's not in the political dialogue, but that you think are the most important things for India to truly level up?
Yeah, and I wouldn't, don't throw the ideological baby out with the bathwater. I mean, and India is infinitely complex. You know this better than anybody else. Like, if you want to do the positive spin on Modi, for all his Hindu nationalism is also very anti the idea of caste. And caste has arguably held back India sorts of socioeconomic and cultural ways. So if you had a Hindu majority, that, okay, so maybe it's more chauvinistic would be probably the word the economist would use from a nationalist perspective, but it gets rid of caste and some of these other ways of thinking about how to order society. Maybe that'd be a good thing. So, like, there's a lot of interesting things that are always happening with India there. And I don't know if you have this experience. I find that on social media in general, word about Modi, boy, the Modi lovers like come after you hard. So I want to say right now, like you said, we're not Indian voters. Like, I care about whether I'm getting the investment decision on India right. The rest is for Indians to figure out for themselves, and sort of both ways. Look, for me, I wrote an article shortly before the pandemic called "The Future of India is in Its Farmers," and I still think that. Hundreds of millions of Indians still are, their basic living is made from agriculture, and India's agricultural system is sort of a weird function of state guaranteed prices and middleman mandis and markets that interact with the farmer itself, that sort of keep things down. And Modi was trying to reform this. And you actually saw this right when Russia invaded Ukraine. Modi came out and said, okay, we are going to save the world. We're going to be the exporter that picks up for Ukrainians, for the slack that Ukraine is no longer able to pick up. We're going to export wheat and all these other things. It took all of 2 to 3 months for the Indian government to ban wheat exports because they had a bad harvest, and they had to worry about keeping the Indian people fed, and also paying enough money to buy farmers' goods so that the farmers wouldn't go out of business in general. So for me, that's the one that sticks out the most. He's tried to make agricultural reforms, and then the farmers go and protest, and then he has to backpedal on them. He has to go back to the way that the system is before. And unless you get real agricultural reform in India, and that's everything from pricing to the use of groundwater to preparing for climate change and how the monsoon cycle is changing, because like all of these things are things that the Indian government needs to work on and is not doing anything with, because anytime they try and make some small change, the farmers protest because they don't want change. They want money in their pockets right now, or they have interests that are related to theirs right now. If you want to go into others, I mean, everything, he's made some progress in unifying tax codes and things like that, but that's still really difficult. But, I don't just work with investors. I also consult for a few companies. And often companies, it's sort of ironic. We talked about Japan in a different episode, and I talked about how on paper, Japan should not be a geopolitical power, but its weaknesses turn into a strength. India is the reverse. On paper, India looks great. And all these companies that I work with, they're like, oh, we want to, they got the labor, it's that they're politically aligned with the United States, access to the Indian Ocean. And then you get underneath the hood and you learn all the hidden costs to do business in India. And it's like maybe we need to go look at a Latin American market or somewhere else in Southeast Asia. And honestly, a lot of that, I mean, some of it comes down to bureaucratic red tape, and some of it comes down to just straight up poverty. Go look at the GDP per capita rates for India as a whole, you'll be shocked at how poor India is. It's a country that's at a per capita level as poor as a country like Haiti, except there's 1 billion Indians. It's just a massive task to think that, okay, you're going to get from point A, where India is today, to you're going to be the next China. And I guess this is the last thing that I would say. I think China is the model here. Everybody's looking for the next China. And the difference between China and India is that I don't know that you get China's economic transformation if it's not run by an authoritarian state. Whereas India is a democracy. And so a democracy there will now be X number of special economic zones where we schools and everything is done so that Westerners can get what, like, that doesn't happen in India. That's what happened in China. So in some ways its democratic aspects prevent it from realizing that potential. And this is where at a sort of top-down policy level, Modi really has failed, because he came in promising business and growth. The world changed underneath him. And now his top goal is self-reliance. It is no longer about being the place that soaks up the exodus from China. It's no longer about manufacturing things, about doing things in India itself, state plans, providing for the Indian market. It's a nice idea, but we've seen in practice that if you're just going to do your own thing, if you're going to block out others, you're going to make them give you technology or impose taxes or restrictions on them if they don't give you the things that you want. There are other options in the world. There are Brazils and Mexicos and Indonesia that will happily arrange their economies to arrange for foreign businesses and won't mess around with the sort of self-reliance rhetoric that Modi has been parroting.
It's interesting you present the dichotomy between India and China like that, because when I was a younger person, I was looking at India's red tape thinking, man, if only there was more of an authoritarian approach to government, things might actually get done. But of course, as you age, you realize that nothing is that simple, as well as what are the cons to authoritarianism relative to what could be the benefits there in India. So we'll definitely have to keep watching it, Jacob. And I want to get your last thoughts, but we really, at the Bitcoin layer, what we're trying to do is understand Bitcoin and global macroeconomics. Part of understanding global macroeconomics is geopolitics and what are the futures of these non-American countries in Asia as the global economy just continues to get more and more specialized and diversified, even in the backdrop of a potential deglobalization trend. So, Jacob, your last thoughts, and then please remind people where they can find your work.
My last thoughts were when you were talking about you younger. It sounds like young Nick was a pretty fervent Modi supporter. Is that fair?
No,
this is exactly what you wanted.
No, and I'm actually talking about way before Modi was in power. Just going to India as as a youth, like as a teenager, and just seeing at that time, let's just say, with the red capitalism wave in China, and watching that happen. And I wrote papers about that in high school, and just contrasting it to the country that I'm visiting every year and seeing, well, where is that growth impulse? You're probably familiar with the saying about India is that it grows at the Indian growth rate, or the Indian rate of growth, right? Which was just to describe this 1% GDP growth every year. And that was always confusing to me when I was younger. But of course, you learn more about what really makes an economy move, and the pros and cons to authoritarian governments versus democratically elected governments.
Yeah. The last thing I'll just say, and this is something that my business partner at Cognitive always says, Rob, so I'll steal from him. Quantity has a quality all of its own. So everything that we just said about India from that perspective, you've still got, 1 billion plus young people who are hungry for their place in the world, who are hungry for a better world for their families, who want to make money and ascend global value chains and all these other things. And that, I think, more than anything, is what India has going for it. And maybe looking top down is the wrong model. Maybe if India is going to do well, it's going to be that groundswell from the bottom up of young people who want to build new things or take risks. Maybe that's going to be it. I think when you look at Indian equity performance, that line, that quantity has a quality all of its own, might be there because you have millions of Indians who realize the stock market exists. And so now they're buying stocks. And that's one of the reasons I think the Indian market, it surprised me. It's gone up and to the right. I thought it had topped out. I can send you a paper from January 1st, 2023, where I advised some of our traders on the staff, like, hey, I think maybe the rally's a little long in the tooth here for India. Made me look stupid, kept on going up and to the right. And I think that wasn't necessarily because, the valuation. It was because millions of Indians wanted to buy stocks because they all want to put their money somewhere to save it. And unlike China, you're not going to build in the ghost cities or with the real estate developers. That sounds like in India a good way to get your money stolen. Like maybe go after these companies where there's at least some corporate diligence. For where to find me, our website's broken. It's cognitive.investments, but you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments or find my own podcast, Cognitive Dissidents, to learn more about what we do.
Absolutely, Jacob. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Bitcoin Layer. And one thing that our viewers and listeners absolutely know is flow drives prices. So that echoes what you're saying. If young Indian people have the money to spend, it will send those equities higher. Jacob, thanks for joining us once again at the Bitcoin Layer, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Sounds good. Cheers.
Special thanks to River for sponsoring this channel. Purchase Bitcoin without any fees when you use River's DCA feature. River has become our trusted source of accessing the Bitcoin market because they don't use any third-party custodians. This is a very, very important thing to understand. River is not using another company to store the Bitcoin for them. They have their own multi-signature solutions, which means that they have designed their own way to make sure nobody else has responsibility for the Bitcoin for the time that you have River hold your Bitcoin for you on their platform once you have purchased it. So go check out river.com today. Thanks for sticking with us. As always, at the Bitcoin Layer, subscribe to our channel. Subscribe to our Substack at thebitcoinlayer.substack.com so that you can follow along our latest research and analysis.